Welcome back. Today we'll have one of the longer videos ahead of us, so sit back, get comfortable, and enjoy. We will now begin with chapter 2, which deals with horror in Japanese literature. This chapter will span several videos and is going to cover literature in ancient Japan, medieval Japan, early modern Japan, and the beginning of modern Japan. The current video, the one that you're watching right now, will start with ancient Japanese literature. One last thing, apart from this rough subdivision here, Japanese history can also be broken down into various smaller historical periods, such as the Nara period, the Heian period, and so on. I will occasionally refer to these periods, but don't worry, there's no need to be familiar with them, because whenever I talk about a specific period, I will show you the respective dates on screen anyway. And now, let us begin with horror in ancient Japan. Humans have come face to face with the unknown since ancient times, regularly encountering phenomena that were inexplicable or unfamiliar to them, and so I'd argue that horror, and the uncanny in particular, have always been accompanying us in the shadows of our everyday life since the very beginning of mankind's existence. It also seems reasonable to assume then that ever since people became able to form coherent sentences, scary stories must have existed as well. Now, of course, we don't have a time machine and can just go back as far as possible and directly ask everyone for uncanny tales, so our only way to seek out horror from ancient times is to look for written records, and anyone who searches for the earliest Japanese work of literature ever written will usually come across the Kojiki from 712. The title Kojiki can be translated as Records of Ancient Matters, and the work is a sort of chronicle of various myths, historical accounts, and more. But is there anything that qualifies as horror? Anything of uncanny quality in this work? There is. The Kojiki contains the story of Yomi no Kuni, which is basically the Japanese term for the underworld or the land of the dead. In this tale, the god Izanagi enters the dark world of the dead in order to bring back his former wife, the deceased goddess Izanami, and yes, their names are almost identical. I know, it can be confusing. The tale is told in a rather sober tone in the Kojiki, but nonetheless, I would be surprised if its gloomy topic and scenery did not manage to make a fair share of readers back then experience an uncanny feeling, because entering the world of the dead is certainly a passage from the familiar into the unknown, into a place where we're not at home at all. And the thick darkness of the underworld that surrounds Izanagi while he traverses this strange land does on the one hand raise the fairly creepy question of what might lurk within the darkness, but could also represent the unknown that is death itself. Izanagi does indeed find Izanami, but she sends him away, telling him he is too late. Still, she says she will try and negotiate with the god of the underworld, and also makes Izanagi promise not to look at her, and then leaves for said negotiation. So far, he hadn't really seen her anyway, since it was so dark, but he eventually follows her and finds her sleeping in the darkness. He then breaks his promise and creates a torch to look at her body, only to find that it is rotten and crawling with maggots and other creatures. In Shinto, which is one of Japan's oldest religions, death was often associated with impurity, which might explain the horrible sight that awaited Izanagi when he broke his promise. The land of the dead in the Kojiki is a dirty, unclean place and the final destination for everyone who dies. There's no torture or punishment or anything of the sort though. Concepts like heaven, hell, and salvation that many of us probably know from Christianity mainly came to Japan through the spread of Buddhism. Now let us revisit the moment when Izanagi shines a light on Izanami's rotten corpse. This is not only gruesome and shocking, but also contains some uncanny quality because there are 8 gods of thunder living in her body, staring back at the shocked Izanagi. You could say that quite literally something foreign is living inside this once familiar body, and the fact that these alien beings inside her body are staring back at him in the darkness is certainly creepy in my book. Furthermore, the whole scene is somewhat evocative of Freud's concept of the uncanny as something that becomes uncovered, even though it should have stayed hidden, if we liken the entire scene to shining a light on our own mortality, which is a topic that many people do like to try and forget about in their daily life. Now, that concludes the Kojiki discussion. Moving on. In the year 713, 1 year after the Kojiki, Empress Genmei issued an order that every province shall compile reports about their various distinct features, such as their climate or their geographical, topographical, and cultural peculiarities. These reports were called Fudoki, which roughly translates to accounts of the land's natural features, and many of these Fudoki also contained mysterious or uncanny accounts of strange creatures or places. For instance, the Izumo Fudoki, a Fudoki from 733 that deals with the province of Izumo, tells of an alleged tree near a rocky coast where a hole can be found that leads into a cave, and it is then claimed that this hole was the entrance to the world of the dead. It is also written that whoever dreams of this hole and approaches it in their dream will soon die in real life. Legends like this one certainly add a very uncomfortable feeling of proximity and tangibility to the world of the dead, since they do not define it as another dimension that is completely separated from ours and unreachable until you actually die, but instead they portray it as an actual geographical location directly linked to our world. Next, I would like to briefly touch upon a topic that many of you have probably already heard at least once: yokai. The term itself just combines two kanji that both have meanings like suspicious or mysterious, and nowadays this word is often used with regards to all sorts of monsters, ghosts, fairies, and other strange creatures. Hell, the game Yokai Watch even treats them kind of like Pokemon, but as I said, this use of the term comes from rather recent times. In ancient and medieval Japan, the term yokai doesn't actually appear that often. Nonetheless, one of its first occurrences is from ancient Japanese literature, which is why I wanted to throw it in here before we pick it up again in later chapters. It appears in the work Shoku Nihongi, the second in a row of historical chronicles, which was completed in 797. Therein we can find mention of a purification ceremony that had to be held at the imperial court because of the regular appearance of yokai. It should be noted though that although in current times yokai seems to cover a wide range of creatures, its translation often including words like ghost, phantom, demon, monster, goblin, spectre, and more, back then the word yokai usually just referred to strange occurrences in general. When people wanted to refer to actual threatening creatures, especially those of human-like shape, the word oni was very common during the Heian period. Nowadays, oni is often translated as demon or ogre. Related to oni is the word hyakki-yagyo. Oni is actually right there within this 4 kanji term. It's just read differently in this case, ki instead of oni. This whole term basically translates to 100 oni walking around at night, and in texts from the Heian period, this term was often used to describe processions of menacing creatures through Kyoto. Certain practitioners of divination at the court, so-called onmyoji, would even give warnings when a hyakki-yagyo might be imminent so as to avoid it. Another term that was fairly prevalent during the Heian period is mononoke, which some contemporary dictionaries list as ghost or spectre, but just like yokai, it was also more of a term for uncanny and unexplainable things as a whole, including but not limited to spirits and such. And as it happens, the term mononoke also appears a few times in the next work that I want to introduce, the Genji Monogatari, a work of ancient Japanese fiction, as in fiction, where we have an author who didn't claim that anything they wrote actually happened, but who truly just wrote stories in order to entertain people. Genji Monogatari, usually called The Tale of Genji in English, was written in the 11th century by the court lady Murasaki Shikibu. A large part of the Genji Monogatari deals with the love life of the main character, Prince Genji, and portrays the life of luxury and infighting at the imperial court. However, a certain chapter called Yugao has some fairly eerie contents. In this chapter, Genji becomes fascinated with a beautiful young woman who lives in a rundown house. She refuses to reveal her identity to him. He does the same, by the way. They both have their reasons for this, and so instead of learning her true name, he calls her Yugao, named after the flowers of the same name, in front of her house. Eventually, Genji takes Yugao as well as her maid Ukon to an abandoned mansion in an isolated area, and this is where the story enters the realm of the uncanny. The mansion is in disrepair, the abandoned property poorly maintained, all of which creates an eerie sense of foreboding. Yugao herself was scared, and for many reasons probably, since she didn't even want to go in the first place and still doesn't know who Genji truly is. The atmosphere eases up a bit during the day when Genji reveals his true identity to her, and they eventually spend some pleasant time together. However, as the sun begins to set and darkness befalls the deserted mansion, Yugao becomes more and more restless the darker it gets. Finally, it is night, and at some point, they both fall asleep. But in his dream, Genji sees a beautiful woman at his pillow who scolds him for spending his time with this Yugao instead of her and tries to drag her away. Frightened, Genji awakens and realizes that the light has gone out. It is completely dark in the room now. It takes some time until a torch is brought into the room, and when Genji shines its light on Yugao, he suddenly sees the apparition from his dream floating there and then disappear. Yugao, on the other hand, is dead. Whatever it was that Genji had seen first in his dream and then in reality, it had apparently taken her alive. The scenery is then described once more, but this time no romance is left to distract from its eeriness. Genji is filled with regrets for taking Yugao to such a place, and we are told that the wind is blowing, trees are moaning, and strange bird cries can be heard. As far as I'm concerned, I would maintain that this entire scene definitely belongs into the realm of horror and the uncanny, and must have been fairly creepy even for readers in ancient Japan. First of all, there's the abandoned mansion. That's a place where you're definitely not at home, and you can never know for sure if you're truly alone in there. Granted, it's not like you will always be safe in your own home either, but at least you typically perceive it as such. A deserted mansion, however, lacks this intrinsic feeling of safety. Instead, it's filled with uncertainty. The darkness of the night and the surrounding forest fall into a similar category. They're filled with uncertainty and the unknown. Next, the way the ambient noises are described during the scene when Genji is filled with regret further adds to the eerie atmosphere. There's the strange bird cry. Genji isn't even sure what kind of bird it is. And there's the moaning and creaking of the trees in the wind. I'm sure many of you, especially those who have lived close to trees or forest, or who have gone camping at least once, know from first-hand experience how easily the sound of creaking branches or snapping twigs and the like can cause us to doubt and wonder what exactly it was we just heard. And indeed, if you look for scholarly discourse on this particular chapter, you can even find discussions that literally highlight the tree noises and the strange bird cry as examples of the uncanny quality of this particular scene. Then there's the ghost that appeared and brought harm on Yugao. One thing that makes it particularly uncanny is that we don't actually know its identity. Who exactly was this ghost? Many interpretations claim that this apparition is in fact a living ghost called Ikkyu-ryo or Seirei in Japanese, a kind of disembodied spirit that has been manifested through strong emotions of someone who is actually still alive. They claim it was the living ghost of the proud and jealous Lady Rokujo, a longtime mistress of Genji within the story, whose spirit might have severed itself from her body when she slept. The book Genji Monogatari no Hiroin Tachi by Enchi Fumiko from 1987, for instance, outright names Lady Rokujo as the one who killed Yugao, as if that was a well-known fact, without ever considering an alternative possibility. And, well, if we take into account that the apparition reprimanded Genji for spending time with Yugao instead of her, then this certainly seems plausible. But on the other hand, isn't it curious that Genji himself, when he saw the woman in his dream, never said anything like, "Lady Rokujo, it's you." Rather, he seemed genuinely surprised, confused, and intimidated by this figure. I must admit that I never read the entirety of the tale of Genji myself, but at least Higashi Masao in his book Kaidan Bungei Handbook claims that there is no definite proof which confirms whether or not this was Lady Rokujo. He thinks of this apparition as a mysterious figure that ultimately remains strange and unexplained, and that makes it an uncanny apparition in more than one way. Okay, with that, we have dwelled long enough on this scene. By the way, if you want to read the Yugao chapter yourself, I have put 2 links into the video description where an English and a modernized Japanese version of this chapter can be found. Next, I would like to turn our attention to a certain genre, that of setsuwa. It's somewhat difficult to define this genre, especially since the term itself can already be found in the 9th century, but the way it is used nowadays originates in the end of the 19th century. But representative setsuwa works such as the Konjaku Monogatari Shu from ancient Japanese literature, or the later Ujishui Monogatari from medieval Japanese literature, show that setsuwa were presented not as fiction, but as short anecdotes, as records of events that allegedly happened in real life. Furthermore, many of these setsuwa contain didactic elements based on Buddhist doctrines and thus serve to teach the reader a lesson. And in order to do that, they also sometimes used grotesque or uncanny elements. Let us take a brief look at the Konjaku Monogatari Shu. The title means collection of tales from the past, and it was written around the end of the Heian period. The 27th volume of this collection in particular deals with supernatural beings like demons or ghosts. Therein we can find, for example, the story of a married couple that is on their way to Kyoto, but on their arrival cannot find a proper inn to stay at. They then hear that the Kawarano Inn, a mansion which once belonged to the noble Minamoto no Toru, is now deserted, and eventually they manage to get permission to stay there. But one day, when it is already evening, a set of doors behind the husband gets thrust open. He turns around, thinking some person must have opened them, but instead sees an unknown creature stick an eerie hand out and grab the wife who happened to stand by the door. The husband tries to stop the weird arm, but the woman gets dragged inside the room from where the hand came. The door closes and doesn't open anymore. The husband tries many other doors, searches for another way inside, and even goes to another house to bring a group of people back for help, but it's all to no avail. Finally, he decides to use an axe to break down the door. At this point, it has become night, and he enters the pitch-black room with a light, only to find the lifeless body of his wife hanging on a rack for clothes. Her body has no visible wounds, but she is clearly dead. In a way, this is reminiscent of the previously mentioned scene in the tale of Genji, albeit less romantic and a lot more abrupt and brutal. Still, I do find it fairly uncanny, especially the fact that except for the arm, nothing is really known or clearly seen when it comes to this creature. As previously mentioned, Setsuwa usually has some sort of lesson to teach the reader, and so this tale concludes with a warning that people shouldn't make light of staying overnight at old and unknown places, and the uncanny creature here certainly serves to drive the point home. Another work from the Setsuwa genre is the Nihon Ryoiki, compiled in about 822 by a monk called Kyokai. The title of this work can be translated as Accounts of Wondrous Things That Happened in Japan, and one of its tales deals with a monk that falls in love with a statue and prays that he may find a woman who looks exactly like the statue. One night he has an obscene dream, and the next day he finds semen on the statue. The entire tale isn't very long, but still contains details like the exact location, describes a few developments before the whole incident becomes public, and also mentions how people allegedly traveled to the statue to witness the stain on it. Such details were fairly common for many Setsuwa and could be compared to a certain genre that is quite popular nowadays, namely that of Jitsuwa Kaidan, which refers to strange or scary tales that are supposedly true. Jitsuwa here means true story, and Kaidan, which is usually translated as ghost story nowadays, consists of the kanji for mysterious and story. That is not to say though that these two genres are completely similar. For instance, Setsuwa were rather short, while Jitsuwa Kaidan can also be fairly long. Still, just as the attention to detail in today's Jitsuwa Kaidan serves the purpose of making the story more believable, the same can be said about Setsuwa back then, although the ultimate goal certainly differs. While Jitsuwa Kaidan are mainly just a form of contemporary entertainment, the intent behind Setsuwa was to spread Buddhist teachings about the consequences of good and bad deeds. In that respect, it certainly makes sense that some of them combine the uncanny or the grotesque with elements that underline their alleged authenticity, such as mentioning exact locations or claiming that several people witnessed something. After all, you could instill a lot more fear of the consequences of immoral deeds with a story that people consider to be actually true. I have to say though that unlike the Setsuwa about the wife being grabbed by an eerie hand, the Setsuwa of the monk and the statue does not really belong to the realm of horror and isn't really uncanny. It doesn't create any uncertainty, any sense of threat or the like. The fact that the story deals with a dream, however, is interesting. Earlier we heard about the Izumo Fudoki with its account of an entrance to the underworld and the warning that certain death awaits those who go near it in their dreams. We heard about the tale of Genji with its Yugao chapter, in which the apparition that takes Yugao's life first shows itself in Genji's dreams and then in reality. And while the story with the monk and the statue wasn't particularly scary, it's also an example of a dream that had an influence on reality. And these are just a few examples. I'm sure you can find more stories in ancient Japanese literature that make use of dreams as supernatural elements which can influence reality. And fittingly, Sigmund Freud, in his work on the interpretation of dreams, writes that people of classical antiquity took it for granted that dreams were related to the world of the supernatural beings in whom they believed, and that these dreams brought inspirations from the gods and demons. And although Freud's statement refers to people of classical antiquity, ancient Japan was probably similar in this regard. For most people, dreams back then must have been more than a simple physiological process. Many felt that dreams offered a connection to the unknown world beyond the living, to the realm of the supernatural, which in turn made dreams a great means for introducing uncanny elements if an author so desired. In a way, this holds true even today. I reckon fewer people connect dreams to the supernatural nowadays than back then, although I'm sure plenty plenty still do, but either way, we still haven't fully figured out everything about dreams, and so they remain a mysterious phenomenon for many people, even today. But back to ancient Japan. All in all, the belief in ghosts and the paranormal was more or less part of everyday life in ancient Japan. Shinto even taught the animistic belief that spirits dwelled in all things. Myths of the country's supposedly true origins were directly linked to the realm of gods and the supernatural. Dreams could be seen as a window to the other side, and people must have been confronted with a lot more unexplainable phenomena than today. In short, there was a great deal of room for the unknown, and so it comes as no surprise that we can find scary or uncanny elements if we take a look at legends, rumors, tales, or fictional works of this time period. In her book, Tales of the Supernatural in Early Modern Japan, Noriko T. Reida does, however, note that uncanny elements back then in works such as the Tale of Genji or the Konjaku Monogatari Shu usually only made up a small part of the whole, especially when compared to the Kaidan boom that would occur much later. But that's a topic for another time. And with that, I shall conclude this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, which will be fairly short but will introduce two curious terms that are going to be of relevance later on. Until then, take care and goodbye.